Hello and welcome to the Full Scottish. It's Sunday the 6th of February. I'm Hugh Stewart and I'm in the Glasgow studio. Now joining us for today's programme in Kirriemuir we have Ruth Watson, journalist and campaigner. Good afternoon, Ruth.
Hello.
It's afternoon now. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
And also down just outside Kilmarnock, we've got the Member of Parliament for Kilmarnock and Loudon. That's Alan Brown. And thanks for joining us today again, Alan. So you're
My
loud and
pleasure to
clear.
be here. Good afternoon.
Excellent. So we're going to discuss, I was just saying earlier on, really, could be called the crisis edition of the programme because we've got lot of bad news today. Now, let me first of all, before we go on to discuss today's news items, summarise the COVID numbers for the last week. Now, we've seen that the numbers have been coming down. And I don't know where to put numbers. I think we've got 122 sadly have died of COVID in Scotland. That's over the last 7 days. Now, that number is down. It's on here, sorry. So the numbers is one. We now have 990 in hospital. Now, again, that number is down from last week. And let me see. Let's look at the vaccinations in the last and tests. In the last 7 days, 49,483 new COVID cases have been confirmed by the tests, LFT or PCR tests. Secondly, in the last 7 days, yes, as I've just confirmed, 122 confirmed dead, having reported a COVID positive result in the previous 28 days. On vaccinations, 4,419,733 people have received their first vaccination, and 4,134,606 have received their second vaccination, while 3,314,502 have received a third dose or their booster. Okay, so since the start of the pandemic, unfortunately, a total of 10,431 patients who had tested positive for COVID have now sadly died. And just to remind you that in Scotland, the wearing of masks is still compulsory in certain indoor venues, particularly shops, and also, of course, in public transport and buses and trains. I come in on the train today to the city centre, and everyone on my train and in the central station is wearing a mask. Okay, so we'll report once a week, and the Scottish Government is going to update the COVID virus advice in a couple of weeks, I believe. Right, Alan and Ruth, I'm going to move on to our first story today. We're continuing with the cost of living crisis in the UK. Now, we heard this morning that Ian Blackford, the SNP's Westminster leader, has accused Rishi Sunak and the UK government of failing to get a grip with the cost of living crisis. And Ian Blackford has said that what we need now is an emergency budget. And in that, he wants a meaningful package of measures to boost household incomes, warning that what Rishi Sunak has promised so far won't even scratch the surface of the crisis that families are going through. We reported the other day that something like 600,000 Scottish families will be in deep crisis, unable to heat or eat, making those tough choices. And throughout the UK, again, the Resolution Foundation suggested that maybe 10 million people might be having to make that decision about having to turn off the heat or keep eating. So we are in a real cost of living crisis. And so let's turn to you first of all, Alan Brown. So Ian Blackford is saying that the measures taken by Rishi Sunak come nowhere near what is needed. What sort of measures do you think the UK government should be taking?
Yeah, well, Ian's absolutely right. So one of the things we've been asking the UK government to do is actually to mirror the £20 a week child payment that the Scottish Government's doing. So if they actually did that, clearly that would free up more money in Scotland and would get some better consequences. That's one basic they should be doing. Now, also, I've been arguing that they should be putting a lot more money back to families to actually support them against this energy crisis. You know, you only have to look at oil and gas revenues, how much they've increased. So what £1 billion extra this year, £2 billion extra this financial year, the UK government's getting compared to what they predicted in the March 2021 budget. So there's actually a lot of money the Treasury is raking in that they should be recirculating and using it to help support people.
So there is actually money available. Yes, as you said, the oil and gas companies are making unprecedented profits, really. And of course, the UK government gets 5% VAT on energy sales. Ruth, we're going to discuss energy specifically in the next item. The Scottish Child Payment, of course, is going to go up to £20 per child. Now, at the moment, that's for children under 6, I believe, but then the intention is to roll it out to all children under 16. So would you agree with Alan? Is that the sort of measure, that a minimum measure that the UK government should be taking now?
Yes,
Yes, of course.
absolutely.
Sorry, I was going to go to
It's
Ruth.
absolutely inhuman the way in which people are being squeezed. You look back at the UN rapporteur that came to the report looking at poverty in the UK, and he'd described it as being cruel and systematic. This is just an example of it. It almost seems to me as though the Tories in Westminster have gone so far down the neoliberalist rabbit hole that they are intent on using Brexit and many other means to kind of create a modern feudal system where people are so impoverished they have to take whatever jobs are being offered on whatever terms. So say goodbye to any kinds of employment rights, and because people are just going to be so desperate that they will do anything and to take anything that's offered to them just to survive. And people who are on the brink of survival, they don't have time to start contemplating the niceties of, sort of who said what and who went to what party, because they're just fighting to survive. And that is so exhausting. And when you look at the outcomes for children in particular, the evidence is so clear that the direct correlation between the kind of food that children eat and the way they perform at school and the outcomes that has then on the rest of their lives. And so, yes, Westminster should be doing so much more. They could be doing so much more. I watched a report last week um, that was interviewing a couple who both of them were working. Well, the mum was on maternity leave because she'd had another child, and she said, oh, I know that we, her husband had he'd gone back to university and so was working part-time and in education, and she said, well, I know that we had our third child knowing that we wouldn't get any benefits for her, but we thought we could afford her at the time. And they were talking about the choices that they were having to make about how to eat, what to feed their children, what choices they were making about tweet to make sure that their children ate and how warm the house should be. This has been a mild winter, let's not forget. That is one of it's just one of the greatest abominations, and it's a sheer hypocrisy. You've got the likes of Jacob Rees, who sort of in canto, throws out all these nonsensical Latin platitudes. Christ is risen, hallelujah. You know what? I reckon that if the Christ walked past Jacob Rees-Mogg and his lot, he'd be throwing them out with the money lenders, because there is no way that you can have a government that claims to have any kind of religiosity or morals behind them intentionally making children hungry, intentionally impoverishing families. It is cruel and it is intentional. And I've, you know what? if we were in France, people would be out in the streets by now, in a COVID safe way, one would hope. But I
Mhm.
just don't know how much more it will take before people look at the ballot box and say, you know what, we need to make a serious change here.
Yeah, I'd like to take up and remember the word serious. I think that's the tone today, unfortunately, Ruth. We are in a serious economic crisis, the kind of which I don't remember really for a good 30 or 40 years. As Ian Blackford has pointed out, Alan, the dropping of the universal credit uplift actually costs families £1,040 a year. And in return, they're going to be given what he calls a buy now, pay later, 200 quid, a loan of 200 quid, which you have to give back, but they've already taken off 1,040. Sorry, yeah, Alan?
Yeah, no, it's ridiculous. The package the Chancellor announced, as Ian says, it doesn't come anywhere close to doing what it should and what's required. As you've pointed out, the £200 rebate is actually a loan, so there's going to be a £40 surcharge for 5 years after that. And also, clearly, the way the energy prices are at the moment, they're going to stay high anyway, so the cap's actually going to get higher again at the next review, and then you've got to factor in, the £40 uplift. So it's actually embarrassing that he was announcing that as a good measure. It's also illogical in that they refused to do the VAT holiday on energy bills, which we've asked for as well, because the Tories are arguing that if you take VAT off, it's a flat rate, and therefore effectively that 5% is helping the richest, who have much bigger homes, is their argument. But yet they're doing this £200 rebate, which is a flat rate as well. So that's kind of illogical, the arguments that they're putting forward. But also another concern I've got in terms of energy bills looking forward is they put through the nuclear financing bill, and Labour have backed that as well, and arguing for large-scale new nuclear. But the actual, in terms of the estimated cost of the new nuclear station, it could be up to £63 billion, which is what was in the government's own impact assessment. So that's potentially £63 billion for a new nuclear station to be added to our energy bills, for us to foot the bill for another 70 odd years. So it's actually, if we don't get away from Westminster soon, we're going to be tied to some economic policies that's going to do even more damage in terms of energy, let alone the other policies, which, as Ruth rightly said, is actually prejudice to try and force people into jobs that they don't want to do and actually are low paid. In terms of, if you're looking at wages at the moment or people working, we've got the lowest levels of in-work poverty in 100 years. So that's how damaging the current policies really are. So people are working and are actually still in classes being in poverty.
Yes, wages are rising something like 1.5%, but we announced last week that the inflation is probably 5.4% and expected to go higher this during the spring. Now, so that's one side of the economic crisis, and of course Alan's also talked about the energy crisis, so let's move on to that now. Now, Alan, while you were on discussing the new nuclear, let's first of all ask you, in general, would you say that is there a strategy, either at UK government level or Scottish government level, for moving towards a just transition? And what I'm really wondering is, in 10 years, 15 years' time, how are we going to heat our houses? Clearly, nuclear is incredibly expensive. So now you, of course, are a civil engineer to trade. Is it possible, is it feasible to have, for instance, municipal heating systems where a whole house or a whole council block is heated by one system? What are the benefits? What are the alternatives to going nuclear?
There's certainly plenty of alternatives to nuclear. Obviously, we've embraced onshore wind, we're embracing offshore wind. You can have hydrogen production as well. And the thing about hydrogen production is that's you making use of excess wind and using that to create hydrogen, which hydrogen effectively becomes your storage buffer. So you can actually use hydrogen as to power fuel cells, likes of batteries and such like. So that's how you get that balance. Nuclear is actually, if you listen to UK ministers argue you need nuclear as a base load to counteract the intermittency of renewables, but actually nuclear is too inflexible. It's actually the wrong power source to have along with the renewables. What we actually need more of as well is pump storage hydro. So we've already got that in Scotland. There's a new scheme ready to go, Corrie Glass, and also Cruachan. They're looking at doubling the hydropower there. But what's needed is actually an energy contract to allow it to get to market, and all that's needed is a kind of minimum floor price for the electricity sales back onto grid, and that would be sufficient to get these schemes up and running. So pump storage hydro is much better fit along with renewable energy, and so that's something that UK government's holding us back on, because they've got that absolute obsession with nuclear energy.
Yeah, Ruth, on that question, I did remember a couple of weeks ago, one of the Tories in Westminster was accusing the SNP of holding Scotland back. And in fact, Greg Hand repeated that this morning on the BBC, SNP is holding Scotland back because we won't let them have nuclear. Well, what's your view on this kind of choice of technologies, renewable versus nuclear?
Right, so you're going to have to bear with me for a wee minute here because I'm about to go off on one of my legendary rants. Um, there is a theory that in order for humanity to be able to deal with nuclear waste in a safe way, we will have to come up with a codex of some sort which will be able to be handed down in terms of cultural rights, perhaps that will last for 100,000 years, because that's the length of time that our the generations to come will need to be aware not to tamper with the big shiny door that they find in the hillside. And so when you think that in the caves in southern France, there's a symbol, it's a really cool symbol. It's three fingerprints like that and like that. And somebody has put that marker on an entrance to a cave that is 3 kilometers through 10 different galleries underground. And you go past that mark and you enter this amazing sort of womb-like cavern where the acoustic is amazing, and there's these incredible 3,000-year-old cave paintings. And for 15,000 years, that symbol was found across the Iberian Peninsula, and now nobody knows what that means. So when you talk about having nuclear power, and you talk about clean energy, and you try and ignore all the problems that come along with it, like Fukushima and Chernobyl and 3 Mile Island, and try and sort of just sort of gloss over those bits. We have to find a way to let the people who will inhabit the planet, that we have left a mess so monumental that if they tamper with it, they and their environment will die. So that's kind of what I think with nuclear. I don't think nuclear is the answer. Regarding hydrogen, I am concerned about hydrogen because, on the one hand, yes, I think it is the future, but on the other hand, we have not yet found a means of delivering it in as clean a way as people, I think, are led to believe. And Alan's an engineer, so he'll be able to explain it better than I. But you've got blue hydrogen and green hydrogen and black hydrogen, and currently the main method of delivering hydrogen to all of our infrastructure. So in order to get hydrogen in a working way, for example, to my gas boiler, it needs to be mixed with a certain level of gas, methane, to be able to for the systems to work. And for sort of that, because of the way that hydrogen is, I'm not very chemically, I'm afraid, I'm not right sure of how to describe it properly. But I also know that the current pipeline infrastructure that we have, that's another reason why hydrogen needs to be mixed with natural gas, because otherwise it would cause too much pitting. So we need to have a complete rethink of the kind of the delivery mechanism that we have for hydrogen, and the way in which that's going to integrate with our current appliances. Because if we're talking about something being green and environmentally sensible, we have to have, there will be at some point, there will be a transition where the appliances and the boilers and the systems that we have will be modified or developed to be able to deal with a sort of a higher ratio of hydrogen, or if, as Alan says, it comes down perhaps as an electricity, as a form of electricity, which is probably easier and we can just plug into it. So hydrogen may well be the future, but we don't yet have the answer. And there's still yet not an industry standard for hydrogen use and its delivery across large systems. So we've got a long way to go, and I think that we just need to be really careful that we don't create a bigger problem and a bigger debt. And I think this whole thing about sort of developing new nuclear stations, well, let's look at Hinkley Point and the involvement that sort of the way in which the Chinese government were sort of potentially going to be handed the national security aspect of the safety of a nuclear power plant and the delivery of power to that area. But I do object very strongly to yet another one of this kind of smoke and mirrors that Mr. Sunak seems so capable of, where we're taxed, but it's called a rebate, where a loan is forced upon us and we're meant to be grateful for us. In that same way, I resent very strongly Scotland having to pay because of the sort of, oh well, hey look, you give us your money and we'll give you a little bit back, and we'll tell you that actually we've spent it on something shiny that you can't use, but you're going to have to pay for it. So I think that Scotland needs to be given the choice, and we need to be given it very soon before people really start to suffer even more than they already are.
Now, let me turn to Alan on this question of hydrogen again. I know you raised that during the week because you're on the House of Commons Energy and Business Committee. Now, I think if I heard your comments right, you're suggesting that the UK government hasn't really made its mind up. Ruth's pointing out that there's been a lot of talk about hydrogen recently as maybe as a miracle solution. So first of all, do you think hydrogen is a runner? And secondly, has the UK government really not made up its mind? Do they not really know what the strategy is going to be, or do they just want the strategy to be nuclear?
Yeah, so in terms of heating our homes, that effectively there's two main solutions. One's to electrify our heating, which would be converting to likes of heat pumps, and or there's talk of hydrogen and having a hydrogen network. So UK government haven't made up their minds yet. The line they use sometimes is we don't like to pick winners, but actually they in a way they do pick what they think's winners, and unfortunately one of them being nuclear energy, as we've already spoke about. So the B Select Committee, of what I'm a member on, so we produced a report this week which was about how we decarbonise the heating in our homes, i.e. that's getting off the methane gas that 85% of us rely on at the moment. And it was quite clear that UK government doesn't have a coherent strategy. So they've put in place, for example, a target of 600,000 heat pumps to be installed every year from 2020 onwards. But at the moment, there's only 30,000 heat pumps per year installed in houses. So that's how far short we are at the moment. But yet there's no strategy how to get there. So one of the things I've called for, and the committee's put it forward as a recommendation, is to actually have that strategy and how you do a rollout. But what I've said is we should be looking at homes that are off the gas grid at the moment, because if you're off the gas grid, then clearly hydrogen isn't going to be an option in the future either. So there's something like 4 million homes across the UK that aren't on the gas grid. So actually, what you should be doing is if you're going to be targeting mass market of heat pumps, then that would be the properties to start with. And also statistically, if you're off the gas grid, you're more likely to be in fuel poverty. So there's actually a potential win-win scenario there where you actually electrify the heating of these properties off the gas grid and help them hopefully move away from fuel poverty. And obviously, and part of that strategy should be putting in proper energy efficiency measures as well. And that's, again, if you look at the difference between the UK government and the Scottish government has treated energy efficiency installation as a national infrastructure project for a few years, and they've actually been commended by the Bees Committee and by the Environmental Audit Committee down at Westminster as well, where both of these committees have said the UK government needs to learn from the Scottish government in terms of what they're doing there and actually replicate that. So that's another key ask of the UK government.
Yeah, it's interesting that. I've read a couple of parliamentary reports. It seems to me that they do good work. And of course, your committee is dominated by Conservatives, but sometimes these parliamentary committees do good research, make good proposals, but that doesn't go straight into government, does it? The government doesn't have to pay any attention to what your committee says, do they?
There's a yes and no to that. So they've got to do a formal response to the committee report. So they've got a time period where they need to come back and then answer to the committee. And that's where the no is, though. So they do have to do a formal response, but they're not beholden to do any of the recommendations that we might put forward. So they're always at liberty, unfortunately, to reject the recommendations, which, as you can imagine, happens more often than we would like.
Yep. So that's where power lies, isn't it? We'll look at the power in number 10 later on in our final story. Now, Ruth, we heard that the equivalent, the Barnett consequentials, if you like, from Rishi Sunak's other package will involve 290 million to the Scottish Government, because he announced the other day, as well as the loan, which you have to pay back. He's also going to give a council tax rebate for councils in England, but the equivalent of that would be 290 million to the Scottish Government. What do you think the Scottish Government should do in the short term? Because obviously hydrogen or whatever is long term, but what do you think the Scottish Government should do now to alleviate fuel poverty?
It's really difficult to know what to do for the best, because if it's a council tax rebate, I assume that that mechanism means that it will have to go back through into the councils.
Aye, but that's in
Now, I
England
was
only.
so okay, so I'm not sure what direction, if that money is going to be earmarked or not. I do know that there's a very, very good project called the Flexible Food Fund, which I was speaking to somebody in Argyll and Bute Council the other day, who was telling me that for if they use the Flexible Food Fund to reach families that are living in food poverty, and she said that at the moment there's an awful lot of people who they've never had to use the system before, they've never had to seek help before, so they don't know what's out there. And she said that often what they can do by helping people to access the Flexible Food Fund, they can sort of get them into the system and find other ways of helping them. So, for example, letting them know about the free sanitary products that's available in Scotland, and other ways of sort of reaching into to help, giving them the kind of proactive dynamic help that is, it's not charity, it's your right. And she said that actually the return that they get on the money that they spend in the Flexible Food Fund is so much more, because they help people manage debt, they help people come into better outcomes. And so I suspect that perhaps organi- probably something along those lines would be very useful, because we have to find ways of helping people access food and heat with dignity. And I think that perhaps is a way of developing better community hubs, making sure that people's homes are insulated, um, perhaps finding a way to make sure that people have got efficient appliances, because a lot of the time, the kind of appliance that you can use to heat your home that is energy efficient may well be out with the reach of the pockets of people who need them the most. I think that
Right.
there's a real situation. There's a real situation at the moment where people who are just out of reach of sort of the sort of statutory support that they're entitled, that people quite rightly are entitled to. There's an awful lot of people. I know our local food bank. They made deliveries to the homes of people with two Audis sitting in the driveway, because furlough and COVID and Brexit has meant that people who perhaps were doing okay, they were self-employed, or they were in some certain sectors that weren't getting any support, and and so their safety net now has gone. Um, I guess one of the things I hope that will come out of this is that people will use their vote accordingly to come up with a better society that means that there's a little bit more fairness out there. I'm not sure
Okay.
what the government can do. 200 million sounds like a lot, but it's actually just blowing in the wind in some respects.
I know that would easily be spent, yeah. So that, as we understand it, then the tax rebate, the council tax rebate, which will be offered to councils in England, the equivalent of that would be 290 million for the Scottish Government to spend, according to our priorities. Yes, as you say, it will soon be spent. So I'm going to move on now from the energy crisis to the political crisis. Now, the latest we've heard this week in the Downing Street reshuffle, where, first of all, a number of top Downing Street advisors reshuffled themselves completely out of the building, is that we hear today that I think it's Steve Barclay has taken over as the Chief of Staff, and this seems to be Johnson's response to saying that he was going to clear up the operation in Downing Street. Now, first of all, Alan, have you heard about the latest developments there? Do you think there's any prospect that Prime Minister Johnson can sell this as a new look Downing Street?
Well, certainly his acolytes are trying to sell it, and I mean, it's quite obvious when person that was head of policy resigned after 15 years. That wasn't him taking proactive action to shape up or to reshape up the operations at Number 10 Downing Street. So she walked out on her own accord and really put the boot into him because of the slur he'd made about Keir Starmer not prosecuting Jimmy Savile. So his acolytes are presenting it as, yeah, that's him doing what he said, that he'd make changes, but it's not really changes that he's in control of as such. And again, while he remains in charge, nothing really is going to change. That's the whole point. He's not fit for office. And so it doesn't matter how many staff he throws under the bus. It's not going to be enough to save his skin in the long run, I don't think. But it'll certainly keep him in Number 10 Downing Street for the short term. But in the long term, his position's untenable. It really is.
Well, yeah, we heard this morning some people in the news are suggesting there's maybe 40 Tory MPs have written a letter demanding his resignation. Of course, the key number is 54, so we don't know how close that is going to get to that. Now, Ruth, on the changes to the team, go ahead.
Yeah, and just to come back into that, I mean, that's the thing. We're there with Theresa May, where for a long time there's all speculation about how many letters of no confidence had been in. But you could also have the position where, what happened to Theresa May, where there was a vote of no confidence. She actually won the vote of no confidence and stayed in place. So that could happen. But again, it shows that our fate is actually in the hands of the Tory backbenchers. It's the Tory backbenchers that get effectively to decide who's going to be Prime Minister for the UK. So that, and again, shows just how undemocratic the current situation is. That we're relying on Tory backbenchers to decide whether Boris Johnson stays in place or not, a guy that we know is unfit for office.
Yeah, of course, it's a fair point, Alan. We're, if you like, spectators, innocent spectators, wondering who the Tories are going to put in charge of Scotland next without being elected. Ruth, what interests you about today's developments? Could this be seen as a power grab by Johnson by putting a Johnson loyalist, a Brexit loyalist, and concentrating power in Number 10? Is he maybe just using this to say, well, I've cleaned everything out, but actually it just means he's concentrating power in himself?
No, I mean we're sort of the Johnson in the bunker days. It's. I think that he was saying that you'd need panzers to get him out of Downing Street, or that was a quote I saw attributed to somebody this morning. I'm not quite sure who, but interestingly, you had Kwasi Kwarteng out this morning, sort of basically telling the BBC that the British people, and I use his words, not mine, don't think that fraud is a crime, and you think, gosh, what else is coming? What I mean? What else? What else is there that that we don't yet know about? And it just it's watching the death throes of democracy. You've got Jacob Rees-Mogg saying that you can't just get rid of Johnson that way because it's pretty much we've now got a presidential system. You've got the chief of staff. I mean, basically, Alan can correct me, I'm sure, if I'm wrong on this, but I thought that was usually a position held by a civil servant because it's a full-time job, not an MP and a government minister. So, I mean, it really is like the Death Eaters are marching into Hogwarts, and I really hope that somebody's got like a means of destroying the basilisk, because it's kind of we're kind of it's pretty scary. I mean, actually, I lived overseas for many years, and I used to watch as a from the outside the politics that were happening over here, and my eyebrows began to raise round about sort of 2009 2010. I started thinking that there's weirdness happening, but we are just plummeting down a democratic rabbit hole that actually I think is very dangerous, and it may look like the death throes of Boris Johnson and his appalling governance. But Rishi Sunak's no better. I mean, this is a man who is positioning himself. Apparently, Munira, I forget her surname, the wifey that stepped down. She's besties with her husband's besties with Rishi Sunak, and Rishi Sunak was the best man at the Allegra Stratton's wedding, and her husband's editor of the Spectator, and he was in trouble recently because he didn't declare that his wife was richer than the Queen. And you look at it and you just think, how is it we've become a nation that has got such such a stomach for accepting this nonsense? How is it? How is it we're taking this? How is it we can't see this? Well, I know the reason we can't see it is because you've got a supine media that, thanks to years of kowtowing to Rupert Murdoch, is now centralised in the hands of about 12 people, one of whom is decades of from the Daily Mail, being decades of sort of Nazi sympathisers and the far right, so Nazi sympathisers during the war, I should hasten to add, but you look at it and you think, the paucity of debate and discussion, the absolutely craven cowardice of my former colleagues at the BBC and elsewhere. You look at Channel 4 and you think, well, this is why they want to privatise Channel 4, sell it off, is because it's one of the last it's one of the last sets of journalists
Yep.
to speak truth to power. We have to be more aware. We can't just look at Boris Johnson and what's going on as some kind of soap opera that that doesn't relate to us. We have to find ways of getting information out and accurate information out, because people are dying now. People are dying. People have been dying in their tens of thousands because of this Westminster government. It's not just the weekly soap opera of Boris Johnson. Oh, he's a bit of a lad. People are dying because of this government's policies.
Now, turning on to the Conservatives, as Alan said, we really have to wait for the Conservatives to do something, and that just shows the lack of influence that the Scottish voters have in the political system. However, we hear this morning that Kirsten Oswald has turned the spotlight on the Tory 5 members of Parliament in Scotland. So I don't know, Alan, what information she has, but she seems to believe that none of them has written a letter of no confidence. Well, we know Douglas Ross has, but she's presumably assuming that the others haven't. So the SNP has today asked for the Scottish MPs for the Conservative Party to come out of hiding and send their letters of no confidence into the 22 committee. So as we know, of course, Alan, Douglas Ross did in fact come out for one of the first about 3 weeks ago. So as far as you know, is he the only one of the Scottish Conservatives to demand Johnson's resignation?
Yeah, certainly in terms of Scottish Tory MPs, it's quite clear Douglas Ross is the only one that's come out publicly and is actually a wee bit isolated now. And, it's been well rehearsed, but we know obviously the leader of the House called him a lightweight. So it's quite clear there's big splits in the Tory ranks. And actually that disdain that was shown for Douglas Ross, I actually do share the disdain for Douglas Ross, but it actually shows you how the UK Conservatives really see Scotland. That's Douglas Ross getting treated with the contempt that quite often that we feel Scotland gets treated with. And I think that's where it makes it all the more embarrassing that none of our Scottish Tory MPs are willing to put their heads above the parapets and stick up for their colleague who in theory is meant to be the leader of the Scottish Conservatives, but also really it means they're not sticking up for Scotland at all by keeping their head down. It's pretty poor and pretty craven, to be honest.
There you are, the feeble 5, in the words of Kirsten Oswald. Okay, so again, we'll see what develops in that. So we're going to move on now to look at the crisis on the eastern border of Ukraine. Now, we hear this morning that military strategists believe that Russia now has in place at its western border with Ukraine 70% of the military firepower they would need if they were to plan an invasion. Obviously, the Russian position says that no invasion is planned or contemplated. According to Reuters, a quick attack on Kyiv could risk the loss of up to 50,000 civilians, either killed or injured. There's also estimates of how many troops would be lost on both Russian and Ukrainian sides. So, of course, we still don't know what exactly the Russians plan to do. Obviously, they're not going to say. But it does look like more tactical troops are being moved towards the border. In fact, it's apparently in the tactical battle groups, there's something like 83. There were 60 battalion tactical groups in place last week, and there's now up to about 83 of them. So the number of troops ready for action is building up. Now, so what do you think, Alan, first of all, what do you think is going on there? Do you think this is still a case of Russia increasing the risk in order to demand some climb down from NATO? So the Russians really want NATO to pull back and to remove any potentially offensive weapons from Ukraine. So is this? Do you think this is still increasing the price, if you like, rather than actually threatening an invasion?
Um, I think so, and it's terrible when you're actually hoping that it is high risk saber rattling to get some concessions. I mean, it's clearly a real concern that they continue to mobilise troops, and I mean, it's difficult to know what goes on in Putin's mind, but I have a feeling that it's maybe to get these concessions and obviously reinforce their position in terms of gas supplies, particularly into Germany, and to make sure, because the EU is now actually against Nord Stream 2. So I think that's got a lot to do with what's going on as well. But it's actually terrible that, you know, it's like threatening war to get these concessions in terms of, you know, energy supplies. It is a real worry, but we know obviously Russia's got other influence in terms of, you know, the donations that come into the UK. So we do really need to have a rethink on strategy in terms of how we deal with Russia as a whole, and, you know, in terms of trying to quell that influence that they've got.
Yeah, of course, the First Minister has a story in The Guardian. It's still on the Guardian website this week, demanding more information about or more exposure of the vast amounts of Russian money that flow through the London financial system. Now, Ruth, looking at Ukraine, do you think Ukraine has any room for manoeuvre here? Ukraine, of course, is saying, well, we have the sovereign right to join NATO if you want to. Does NATO mean EU? Most of the westward looking people in Kiev would like to join the European Union, but does that mean they have to be in NATO as well? Or could they be, is there any kind of non aligned way through, do you think?
I'm not sure, and I suspect that the people of Ukraine have been considering their options for a while. They certainly weren't that keen on the idea a few years ago, but I suspect they're keener on it now than they were. And it's very interesting to see what's happening because for years now, Putin, who, let's not forget, he was in the KGB. He was a strong advocate of the USSR, and there's a big theory that perhaps he wants to sort of try and keep a sort of quasi USSR together to kind of counter the strength of the EU and sort of maintain Russia's relevance as the USSR's post USSR's relevance on a global stage. But I think it's more complicated than that. So Russia, they've sort of been like a wolf right snapping at the heels of the you know of the EU for a number of years now. So they've had tanks at the borders of Poland. They've been harrying the people of Finland. So this is really serious. There's no doubt that this is really serious, but it's part of a pattern of Russia trying to see where the weakness is. And I think there's no doubt. I mean, the US just last week was saying that one of the reasons that sanctions wouldn't work was against Russia would not work because the UK is basically a money laundering haven for the US, for Russia and the oligarchs there. And we've got Lebedev in the House of Lords, so there's no doubt that Russian money is buying access to power. You had £30,000 to have lunch with Ruth Davidson and play a game of tennis with Boris Johnson. These kinds of things are, people seem to forget about them, but we should remember. However, and I don't minimize in any way the danger that Russia poses and the strange game that they seem to be playing with global politics. Russia and China used to be mortal enemies, and now here you have Putin and oh, sorry, I forget his name, the president, Xi Jinping, meeting in the last few days. So I think we're sort of in Orwellian territory with the sort of the changing and shifting sands to try and control populations and keep power plays. And I think China has been playing a very interesting long game in terms of wielding influence and the national security that comes with. I mean, China almost owned the ports in the UK until that was decided against. And so I think that we underestimate some of the tactics that are going on. However, we also cannot underestimate the American tactics because you have Biden, who is desperately trying to maintain democracy in a country that almost had a coup inflicted upon it by by the Republican far right and the far right, which in many ways may well have been orchestrated by Russia and the sort of and Facebook. And Carol Cadwallader is paying, the Guardian journalist is paying a heavy price for her expose of the way in which Cambridge Analytica and Facebook sort of wielded power and perhaps influenced elections around the world. But you have Nord Stream 2 going into Germany, but Poland next door, they didn't want to accept that. So they've got what they call the Freedom Pipeline, which is set up to be able to take liquid gas from America. And so if Nord Stream doesn't go ahead, then the answer may well come that it's America that supplies Europe with gas, with LPG, with liquid gas. And I think that we can't look at this in isolation. I suspect that there are games going on that we have no idea about. My husband works in the oil and gas sector and has a very good book, which basically came out about 10 years ago, and it kind of predicted the passage of future global conflicts or potential regional local conflicts as to where the pipelines would be projected for going. And we've seen it in Libya, we've seen it in Iraq, and there's a lot to be said that the Syrian, the conflict in Syria has been engineered because that was where the pipeline was going. That Putin wanted to secure that pipeline route
Yeah, in
that
fact,
was going up.
you've just raised
through.
another aspect really, which I never thought of the energy dilemma. The choice of energy technologies, of course, is the power play. You can't control the wind, can you, Ruth? You can maybe control your oil or your gas, but the renewables don't tend to be like that, do they? They don't have to have the same
Yeah, and I
geopolitical
think
power.
I think that there's a real reason why, for example, Westminster wants to have nuclear. They want to have power that they can control centrally. If you democratize access to energy, for example, the wonderful island of Fula has got what they call the Windy Light, and that's their wind generator, and they're doing amazing things on Fula at the moment. So living a really good, pretty independent, sort of the independent Republic of Fula, and when you've got when energy is democratized and people have direct access to that and to it's a liberating thing, and I think that is one of the reasons why some governments want to centralize power because free power gives people options.
That's right. Yeah, a lot of renewable energies tend to be of a decentralized nature, and they don't necessarily have to have huge state administrations to run them. Okay, so we're going to move on now, looking at the clock. Unusually for the full Scottish, we're now turning to sport. Sport and politics don't mix. Ruth, I'm going to come back to you again. So, what's the latest? Rovers, of course, last week got themselves into a terrible stooshy when they offered a contract to David Goodwillie, the disgraced footballer who was in fact found liable in a rape case. And of course, the stooshy from that, first of all, the women's team, the Wraith women's team, wanted nothing to do with it. So they've in fact broken away, if you like, from Wraith Rovers and are now, I think, known as the McDermott Ladies. So, we've reported already Wraith Rovers really have admitted they made an appalling mistake. So this was, first of all, an attempt to keep politics out of football, but Wraith have realised, particularly with a community club, a club that's running a women's team, you can't just say this is just about football. Never mind what he did, he scores goals. So they've realised that was a big mistake, haven't they?
Are you putting that to me?
Hello, that was Ruth. Sorry, could you hear me, Ruth?
Yeah, sorry, you're looking at the wrong area. I'm over here. Hello.
My mistake.
So,
sorry.
I think I would correct you on a semantic point there. Goodwillie wasn't found liable. He was found guilty of rape. And I think that words matter. He's a rapist, and he's a rapist who scores goals, and apparently some of the men in Wraith Rovers club thought that meant everything was okay. And I've seen some really mealy mouth nonsense coming out of people going, oh, well, what about, hey, the crime happened a long time ago. What about rehabilitation? Rehabilitation comes about when somebody admits what they've done and makes reparation and takes steps to mitigate the horror of what they did by actually trying to become a better person, not just kick a ball about and think that somehow that justifies them. So Wraith Rovers has made a huge mistake. And I feel really sorry for the fans. And I'm actually really proud of those fans that stood up and said, no, this is enough. This is disgusting. We can't have this. And Val McDermid took a real stand, and she loves that club. She took a real stand, and it was obvious that she was heartsick with it. And Tyler Taylor Rattray, the head of the captain of the women's team, who is passionate about the game. She did a really brave thing and stood up and went, no, I can't do this, and be a part of it. So I've got written down here today, 2 o'clock at the Windmill Community Council pitch. McDermott ladies are playing Livingston Dev in Kirkcaldy. And I would think if people are near Kirkcaldy and able to go along at 2 o'clock to the Windmill Community Council pitch and put some money in a bucket there for the McDermott ladies, and I think that would be a really good show of solidarity, because we have to stand up. Scotland's government's doing, and the police are doing some really good work. The Don't Be That Guy advertising campaign. It's really powerful. And I'm really proud of the people who stood up and said to Wraith Rovers, don't be that team. So we all have to take ownership. We all have to, as we've seen with that disgusting Jimmy Carr skit on Netflix. People have to stand up and say, you know what, enough. We're not doing this anymore. We are watching decency being trashed, and we have to stand up and say it takes every single one of us to take a stand. So if people can go along and support Val McDermid and the McDermott ladies, I think that would be an excellent thing.
Okay, that's also a thing we don't very often do, but there you are, the McDermott ladies against Livingston Kirkcaldy today. So I don't think there's any other football happening today. So let's move on from football to, very briefly, the Calcutta Cup yesterday. So the only thing I'm going to say about that is the Calcutta Cup. I've heard some national UK broadcasters this morning and yesterday saying, what went wrong with England? England lost to Scotland. The English team were expected to win. England. So that's why we have broadcast in Scotland. That's all I'm going to say. It wasn't the fact that England came and defeated. It was the fact that the home team won. Oh, okay, so let's move on from there now to Beijing. And we're going to link Beijing to the previous story, of course, about Ukraine, because there are not many international political leaders in Beijing for the Winter Olympics, but Vladimir Putin was there. So once again, the attempt to keep sports separate from politics isn't really working. Alan, can you see that a kind of historic rapprochement now between China and Russia beginning to develop?
It certainly seems that way, and I mean, obviously that is a major concern in terms of geopolitics when you've got two authoritarian states working together, and I mean, both have got appalling human rights records, so that's another concern in terms of them working together. But there's a harsh reality that China does have so much influence in terms of the money that they put in worldwide, in terms of products that they make and sell. So it's certainly not as alarming that they're working with Russia.
Okay, and Ruth, sorry, I was looking at the wrong camera again. Ruth, Putin's obviously made a point of saying that he's going down to China, so most of the Western leaders are not there. So that's obviously significant, isn't it? Is there any point, you think, to a Western boycott? Is there any reason why no senior members from America or Britain are going to Beijing?
Well, the reason is because China is carrying out ethnic cleansing on the Uyghurs and have been committing some horrific acts, not just against the Uyghurs, but other ethnic minorities in China. But the Uyghurs are the most significant because they are a clearly identifiable bloc with a very clearly different religion and culture. I mean, I guess the Tibetans and others were dealt with in the years before television was really in there and social media. I don't think that we can connect Russia going to China with the West not going to China. I think that those are separate yet attached, so separate yet connected. So Putin is going there to show solidarity with China. The Western leaders are not going there to show solidarity with human rights. And I think that the Uyghurs are suffering in ways that really we just aren't addressing, and we should call genocide out and ethnic cleansing out wherever we see it. So, I mean, to be honest, I just think that the Olympics, it's an easy target, and yes, fine, it's one that will be should be taken, and people should be talking about, and I mean, the treatment of that, I can't remember her name, I'm ashamed to say, but the tennis player
Well, that
who
was Pang
claimed that
Shui.
she'd been, yes, the treatment of her, the way in which people are silenced in China, it's really scary. It's really scary. Um, and lots of Chinese people know what's going on, but they're not really in a position that they can do much about it. So I guess that's why the rest of the world needs to try and do something about it too. But there are many parallels between what's happening with China and with Russia, and their expansionist ideals. I mean, China has been quietly expansionist for many, many decades, but the I lived in Malaysia for many years, and they were just starting to build in the sort of this little sort of sand spits in the middle of the South China Sea, which is claimed by equally claimed by Vietnam, Malaysia, the Philippines, Japan, Korea, um, and what's happening? I think it's the Spratly Islands they call them. And what's happening with China? They've now built an artificial island that's got air bases on it, and I don't think that we should be blind to the fact that China has an expansionist agenda, and is using economics as a sort
Yeah.
of soft power across Africa as well. Um, but I think that perhaps we need to find. I think perhaps globalization is creating weaknesses both in our economy and our living
Mhm.
standards, but also in our own domestic security, that perhaps, and global security, that perhaps we've got hard lessons yet to learn.
Yeah, so China, Alan, China's been using its soft power, is the phrase that Ruth used. They're expanding through it's economic imperialism, isn't it? The Chinese haven't actually militarily taken over anyone. If you just leave aside for a minute the extremely important question of their control of Tibet and the Uyghur province, but China's basically using the economy as a weapon, aren't they? But we can't give up China, can we? We can't stop using Chinese goods. So is the West weak when it comes to complaining about China? Are they listening to us? Do they have to pay any attention to our complaints?
Yeah, well, the West, in a way, the West put ourselves in that position by being so reliant on Chinese goods, which effectively that's also meant at one point turning a blind eye to the working conditions, that Chinese are forced into. So we've actually we've allowed that economic argument to override the human rights concerns. So the West has weakened themselves in that respect. It's not that long ago the Chinese were actually dumping steel into Europe, and the Conservatives were against putting tariffs on that Chinese steel, and that actually undermined the UK steel industry. So it's making the right decisions at the right times and not allowing price to
Right, yeah.
override, all the other considerations.
Yeah, that's a good point. And of course, you reminded me, Ruth, that just last week we were discussing genocide in Bosnia. And of course, there's no reason why we shouldn't describe the Chinese treatments of the Uyghurs in exactly the same way. So we can criticise the Serbs because the Serbs don't have a stranglehold over the UK economy. But all we do with China is we say, well, we're not going to come to your Olympic Games. So that's the way it is anyway. So I'm going to finish off now by thanking Alan Brown for joining us in Kilmarnock and Ruth Watson up in Kirriemuir. It's been a pleasure to speak to you this afternoon. Thank you for joining us. And just finally, let me remind you all that we are free to air, and in Broadcasting Scotland we receive no public funding. So those of you who are subscribers are in fact members of the team, which is what's keeping this programme on the air. So if you look online, if you'd like to join us and become one of our subscribers, please look at broadcastingscotland.scot, and then you'll find on there a link. And starting at £5 a month, you could become one of our subscribers and help us to pay our bills, because we're feeling the economic crisis here too. So that's it from us today for Sunday the 6th of February, and we'll be back with Scotland at 7 tomorrow. Right, thanks for watching. Bye.